Get ready for certified USDA prime gun stuff on the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for listening to my podcast and in all the various different ways you support GunGuyTV, watching videos and in many cases, supporting a little financially as well. We certainly do appreciate that. I appreciate it deeply. I'm very grateful for everything you do to help me with this effort of keeping GunGuyTV alive. Frankly, I'm very grateful that you listen to this podcast. I've been doing it for quite some time on Patreon, but this syndicated version is rather new, and I'm excited about the numbers that we're getting as far as people downloading it and listening to it. So I would urge you to continue doing so, and if you are of a mind to do so, please share it with your friends and let them know that the podcast exists. Now, oftentimes in this podcast, I'm going to address things specific about shooting. For example, in the second part of this podcast, I'm going to talk about a hunting trip I just recently went on to hunt for Javelina in Arizona, and some of the things that happened there and some of the lessons that I learned about Javelina and about hunting in general. However, in the first part of this podcast, I want to talk about something else, and that is groupthink and how groupthink can affect us in a very negative way. And unfortunately, the world is There's a lot of groupthink right about now. Now, as you may or may not be aware, when I do this podcast, the first half of it, the first half an hour, is actually syndicated on the normal places where podcasts appear, iTunes and Stitcher, and actually iTunes is becoming Apple Podcasts now. They're trying to do away with the term iTunes, and Google Podcasts, and a host of other places, Spotify, and so on. So you'll be able to find the podcast in all of those places. And in addition, it'll also appear on GunGuy.tv. So if you want to subscribe to it there, you can do that too. And if you want to subscribe to the podcast on a particular platform, if you go to GunGuyTV website, GunGuy.tv or GunGuyTV.net or .com, it'll all take you to the same place. You'll find a little button that you can hit, or a little ad that you can hit that will take you to a place where you can select from the various different applications where you can subscribe to the website. And that way, when your phone or tablet or whatever system you use sees that I've published a new podcast, it'll download it automatically for you. That's how that works. All right, well, anyway, on to the subject matter at hand, which is the entire idea of groupthink. Very recently, Bill Maher, who is arguably an interesting individual, he's a TV host, and he says, to put it mildly, flamboyant things, questionable things, I would say profane things and obnoxious things, but that's part of his shtick. He does that because it gets him attention, and he knows that gets him attention and viewership. That's what he's all about, and I get it. But recently he apparently made some comments, well, not apparently, because I'm going to let you listen to him in a second. He made some comments about Middle America, and he did this on the heels of New York losing the Amazon deal, because New York, in trying to structure a deal with Amazon, was going to reduce the taxes Amazon had to pay over an extended period of time by $3 billion. Now, that meant that New York was going to take in, instead of $23 billion, they were going to take in $20 billion. It isn't as if the city of New York wrote a check to Amazon for $3 billion or gave them money. There's some political folks who paint it that way and sort of color it that way, but that isn't the case. It's simply a tax deal in order to get Amazon to bring the jobs to New York. And it was actually, from what I can understand and know about it, it was a pretty sweet deal for New York City, and Amazon couldn't get their deal because of political nonsense, and so they moved on. Now they'll find another city to do that. Bill Maher is upset about that and feels that Amazon should go to one of the cooler places, not the middle America places, which are, in Maher's opinion, this place where nobody wants to go. Flyover country, abandoned country, whatever the case might be. Now, I'm not going to be bagging on Bill Maher. There's a lot of talk show hosts and radio hosts and so on who've already done that. It's not for me to do that. But I think his comments illustrate something that I want to bring out, that you and I, as Second Amendment supporters, need to make sure we are thoughtful about and avoid. Because when I was going to school, I'm in my 60s. When I was going to school, both in grade school, middle school, and particularly high school, but also in college. I didn't graduate from college, but I did go to college. I just chose to do other things and never finished. And now, at my ripe old age, I'd kind of like to go back and finish my bachelor's degree because I never did. But as I went to college, the professors that I had in college and even the teachers I had and coaches I had in high school were about teaching their students to have the ability and understand how to think critically. So critical thinking was a big deal when I was going to college and a big deal when I was going to high school. People didn't want you to succumb to groupthink. They wanted you to think very critically. And now that's gone away. When you go to college now, unless you fit into the mold of the way in which the vast majority of the academics think, which is very liberal, progressive leaning, then you have trouble getting good grades. You have trouble succeeding. Oftentimes, you have trouble even surviving in a large university or any kind of popular university campus. That wasn't the case when I was going to school. When I was going to school, it was all about thinking individually and thinking critically and examining different things and different possibilities and coming to your own conclusions. And the instructors I had did a lot of that. What I see now in comments like the ones Bill Maher made is that they fit a certain mold, which seems to be very pervasive. So let me have you listen to his comments. I just edited a few little clips out. I don't want to make you suffer through listening to Bill Maher for long periods of time. It can be painful on the ears and on the mind. But let me let you really quickly listen to some of his comments, which if you're from the middle part of America or you're a blue-collar person or working stiff like me, can be somewhat offensive. Then I'll talk about his comments ever so briefly, and then I want to get on about that groupthink thing and how we need to avoid that as we support the Constitution and we support the Second Amendment. So let's run the clip. Here's Bill Maher's comments.
There are two Americas, and it seems like one is where all the cool jobs are, where people drive Teslas and eat artisanal ice cream. We have orchestras and theater districts and world-class shopping. We have Chef Wolfgang Puck. They have Chef Boyardee. Yeah. Our roofs have solar panels. Theirs have last year's Christmas lights. We've got legal bud. They've got bud. The flyover states have become the passed-over states. That's why red state voters are so pissed off. They don't hate us. They want to be us. They want to go to the party. It's like we're the British royal family and they're Meghan Markle's dad.
Now, as you might imagine, I do have some comments about the comments, okay? Because that's my job, right? I mean, I'm a commentator of sorts, even though this is not what I do for a living. My wife and I own Practical Defense Systems. This is something I do because I want to support the Second Amendment. Nevertheless, I'm an influencer, they call me on YouTube, and I'm a commentator. Okay, I guess. I didn't know I had these titles until very recently when I stumbled upon them, and I thought, okay, well, I guess that's what I am. So since I'm a commentator, I'm going to comment. First of all, I got a kick out of the fact that he used canned laughter. It was canned. If you want to go back and listen to it again, go ahead. You can tell it is canned laughter and canned applause. Now, when your jokes are so bad that you have to actually use canned laughter to get a laugh, that's not such a great thing. The other thing I thought you might want to be aware of is a lot of times, now I don't know about Bill Maher in particular, but I suspect that this is true. A lot of these folks do not write their own jokes. They have joke writers who do that, people who write the lines for them, and then they either practice them ahead of time or they read them off the teleprompter. Now, as I watched Bill Maher do this, it seemed to me he was reading them off a teleprompter. This is a key point when it comes to the folks in Hollywood and the folks in television, and much of television where it's entertainment stuff. A lot of these folks, particularly actors and actresses, and to some degree, I think guys like, or people like Bill Maher, really they don't do well unless they're pretending to be someone else or they're reading lines written by someone else. If you think about what actors do, actors primarily, they make their living by pretending. They make their living by lying. They're professional liars. They pretend to be someone they're not, and they speak words that are written by other people. How many times have you seen an actor go into a public place and say what they actually think and make complete and total fools of themselves? Suddenly you realize just what a complete ignoramus this individual is, and it's because they're speaking their own mind. And if they're popular or they're identified with a particular fictional character that you like, it can tear down your entire image of that individual, because you think to yourself, well, how could so-and-so actually say that? Well, so-and-so is actually the character they play. It's not who they really are. It's the character they play that you like, and you like the character they're pretending to be, and you like the lines they speak that some other person writes about that character. But when you actually have to listen to the actor themselves, sometimes they can be quite disappointing. In fact, frankly, sometimes they can be quite despicable, and I've found that many of the case. And so with Bill Maher, my suspicion is, since he looked like he was reading it off a teleprompter, that he did not write these jokes. He was just spitting them out. And that gets back to this whole thing. Just recently they had the Oscars, I think. And when you listen to these actors parrot the same lines over and over again, it's as if they're reading from a script, which is the only thing they know how to do well in many cases. But they're all reading from the same script. Like musicians, they're all playing from the same sheet of music. It's groupthink. It's not individual thought on their part. They're going down the direction that they feel they have to go in order to maintain their popularity in the industry in which they work. And then when you have the ones who don't, the ones who refuse to do so, then one of several things happens to them. They either find themselves blacklisted and can't work, or they start making alternative films and alternative projects. You look at guys like Dean Cain. Dean Cain played Superman on television in a cute show called Lois and Clark many, many years ago. And Dean Cain is actually an excellent actor. He's a very good actor, and he's had some motion picture parts and so on. But he is now he's been for quite some time a very conservative guy and very vocal about that. And as a result, he really doesn't get that many mainstream parts. He gets some, but not very many. But what he does do is a lot of alternative films that he either produces or he works with small production companies to do that. It's not that their career goes away. It's that they have to have an alternative career that is not that mainstream vehicle that they had before, because they didn't succumb to the groupthink idea. So even when you listen to Bill Maher's statements, if you really think about it, it only applies to people like Bill Maher. It only applies to the uber elite leftists. It only applies to the liberal elite in the coastal areas of, New York, California, up in San Francisco and Los Angeles and like that, because he doesn't mention, when he talks about the party being, in the blue states, in the blue areas along the coast, he doesn't mention the fact that people and businesses are leaving these places and leaving these states in droves, that the taxes are enormous, the cost of living is ridiculous, the people who work for these companies in many cases can't afford to live there, so they have to live somewhere else and then commute all the way into town. I remember in the last big bubble with real estate that in the San Diego County area, San Diego County real estate became so expensive that people could not buy here. Fortunately, my wife and I had already bought our home, and we bought a condo over near La Jolla in University City as a rental, and we'd purchased those properties already. But so many people were moving up to the northern part of San Diego County, into the Temecula area, Temecula and Hemet and so on. They were moving way up there, even though it was an hour drive away, because they worked in San Diego, but they couldn't afford to live in San Diego, so they had to move way up there. And that was north of us, almost to Riverside County. In fact, I think it is Riverside County. And then at one point, they were starting to move east of us, out into Imperial County in Imperial Valley, and move into El Centro. In fact, my wife and I bought a house out in El Centro because that's what was happening. And now all these years later, the Imperial Valley is growing, El Centro is growing, and a lot of the folks that are moving there, many of them are people who work in the San Diego area, but they have to drive an hour and a half or more to get to work and an hour and a half back. That's 3 hours of driving a day because they're going to work in a major California city. That's ridiculous. But of course, the Bill Mahers of the world don't have to do that, so they don't think about that. They don't mention the homeless problem that California has, because the Bill Mauers of the world do not have to drive past the ever-growing homeless encampments. They don't have to walk past the human feces and excrement that is on the streets. Yeah, that's the party I want to join. Don't you want to join that party? Yeah, the folks in Arizona and the folks in Alabama and the folks in the Midwestern states out there in Kansas and Arkansas, yeah, they want to move to San Francisco so they can join that party, right? This is the silliness of their argument. It's a very, very small contingent of people who are very wealthy who look down on everyone else, and that's their mentality. But the thing that strikes me the most, in addition to the fact that the obvious foolishness of it, he talks about food and culture and all these other things, and he forgets that, down there in certain parts of the country he doesn't like, we have bluegrass and bluegrass festivals. We have country music, which is vibrant American music. We have, I got to tell you, when you want some great food, go down south. You want some outstanding food, there's parts of the Midwest and parts of that area where you eat very, very well. And by the way, I have met some ranchers in my life whom Bill Mauer thinks are murdering chickens and thinks are these evil people. They're doing very, very well with huge ranches. They could buy and sell Bill Mauer 2 or 3 times a day and not ruin their pocketbook. So, Bill Mauer is very foolish. The food he eats, in many cases, the clothes he wears and the material made for them, the various different things that he relies on day to day for his life are all made, built, produced by people in that flyover abandoned country he thinks is flyover abandoned country. Without them, guys like Bill Mauer couldn't survive, because the truth is they don't know how to do anything except run their mouths. What I find fascinating about it is that they all say the same stuff. Have you noticed that? I mean, if you watch, I didn't watch it, I just watched the clips afterwards, but if you watch the Oscars, which I cannot sit through because it will drive me completely bonkers, they all said pretty much the same thing. It's kind of like you're watching the beauty pageant and all of the contestants, when asked what their main thing they hope for, all say peace on earth. They may not really want peace on earth or even think about peace on earth or really consider peace on earth, but they figure that's the standard answer, so they'll spit that one out. A lot of these Hollywood folks are the same way. And not just Hollywood. Now, you go out and you talk to folks who are uber liberal, who don't have a clue what's going on in the world, what's really happening, because they only watch CNN or they only watch MSNBC. That's their source for the news. So they're low information voters. They have no idea what's going on. And they spit out the same kind of ridiculous nonsense. I find it with the Second Amendment all the time. It's astounding to me, the same kind of foolishness I hear from people on a regular basis. They have no idea what the Second Amendment says. They have no idea what the purpose of it when it was written is. They have no idea why the founders included it in the first place. They don't have any of that knowledge. In fact, I'm going to tell you something. These folks that subscribe to groupthink, while they consider themselves to be among the best educated, are the worst educated, dumbest people I've ever met in many cases. They really are. They don't have a clue about the founding of this country. They don't have a clue about historical lessons of the country or anything else.
You're listening to the GunGuyTV podcast.
Now, when I started this, I compared all this to when I was growing up. Now, when I was growing up, it was a little different, and obviously. And when I was in school, particularly in college and high school, teachers really focused on helping you be a critical thinker. I'll give you an example. I took a class in college that I took it on a lark. It really had nothing to do with my major. I took it because I thought it might be interesting, and I got to confess, I took it because I thought it might be easy. Boy, was I wrong. That course was not easy. It was tough. It was a course in cultural anthropology. Now, the guy who taught this course was about as odd could be. He was, as far as fitting into the socially accepted framework of our society, he just didn't. In fact, you look at him and you'd think, this guy is about a half a bubble off plum. He really is. But he wasn't. What he was a guy who was an individual. I remember he used to send us out to have us do these goofy projects. We didn't have any homework in this class. It was all it was a huge theater. He came in, he lectured, and he got conversations going and discussions going, which is very unusual because in these big theater type classes, generally your instructors, and often the case, are researchers who were hired by the college as researchers, and they have to teach. So they come in, they present the information as quickly as possible in as short a manner as possible. They take no questions, they write on the board, and then they go out, and you never see them until the next time you have to come to class again because they want to get back into the lab or whatever, because that's what they focus on. They're only teaching because they have to. This guy was indeed a researcher, but I think he loved to teach. I'll give you some ideas of things he had us do. He would have us go out into the world and do stupid stuff to see what kind of responses we got so that we could understand where social norms break down. For example, he had us go out and get in an elevator, and he would have us get in an elevator 2 or 3 at a time. The 2 or 3 of the classmates, we get in an elevator. And we'd wait till other people, maybe 1 or 2 people got in the elevator with us, and then as the elevator's moving, we would turn around and face the back. And slowly but surely, if the ride was long enough, almost without exception, the other people who were in the elevator who had no idea what was going on would slowly turn to face the back because they didn't want to be different. He had us get in an elevator. I thought this was hilarious. He had us get in an elevator because we wanted to find out what percentage of people would actually respond to this in some jovial fashion, what percentage would look at us as if we had 10 heads. So it'd have us get in the elevator, one of us, and then as the elevator goes, we'd wait until there was a fairly packed elevator full of people. We'd stand in the front by the door, and as the door closed and it started to go, we'd turn around and say, okay, I called this meeting because, and we'd announce something about the meeting, just to see what reactions we would get. Now, almost invariably, you would get one person who got the joke and would laugh and say, well, I'm so glad I attended the meeting, or some quippy thing, or whatever. And then you would have other people who looked at you and kind of turned away, and the most of them would just ignore you and or look at you as if you had 10 heads and get out of that elevator as quickly as possible, want nothing to do with you. One of the things he had us read, which I thought was fascinating, was a book by Alvin Toffler called Future Shock. Now, you may have never heard of the book, but I'll explain it to you briefly. And then we'll pull this back to the Second Amendment. He essentially took a term called culture shock, which culture shock, if I can describe that in a way that makes sense, is, let's say, for example, we took an individual who grew up in a specific town with a specific culture. He'd never been anywhere else. He spoke that language and no other language. He understood that culture and the things that were acceptable in that culture, what they would call social norms. And those various things he understood within that culture, and that's the only culture he'd ever been exposed to. And we're going to pluck him out of that. We're going to take that individual, we're going to take him to a completely different culture where the language is different, the socially accepted norms are completely different, everything is different. We're going to take him there, and we're going to plunk him down and drop him right in the middle of that alien culture, and he would then suffer something called culture shock, because he would have to learn to function within a culture that he did not understand, where he stood out like a sore thumb, where he didn't speak the language, where nothing he knew fit. Everything he knew in their eyes, in the eyes of this people in culture, the people in his culture, would be wrong, would be unacceptable. And he would have to then figure out, how am I going to survive here? Am I going to survive by being willing to be different, or am I going to survive by trying to assimilate in some fashion? Now, Alvin Toffler took that idea, and he crafted a book called Future Shock, in which he discussed the way our society is changing and the way it will change over the following decades. And he talked about how people will be so much more mobile in their jobs and their place of living and so on, that the future will be moving so fast that it'll be almost impossible for people to keep up with the culture, and that they will suffer a form of shock that's kind of like culture shock but different. It's future shock, because it's impossible for them to really keep pace. This is where kids are moved from household to household to household as their parents change jobs and change locations. And so the kids never build any long-term relationships in school because they never stay in one school long enough to do it. These are all things that Alvin Toffler proposed as possibly happening in the future. Now, if you go back today and get that book and read it, it'll be stunning to you how this guy got so much right, because he really did. He had it nailed, and he was exactly right. Now, I read this book. I'm in cultural anthropology, and this is my point. And this is my only professor at the time who actually had an office hour that he was at. Nobody else did that. It was the TA or whatever that was there that you saw in the office hour. You never saw the professor in the office hour. And he had actually 2 office hours during the week, which a lot of times they didn't. They'd have 1. And he would see students. I remember sitting asking him after reading that book. I was concerned, as I would be with any of my other classes, on the dates and times and the details of the book, because I'm thinking this is going to be in one of the tests that we have to take. And really, I think 70% of our grade, if I remember right, in that class was actually the huge paper we had to write at the end, which covered what we learned in the class. I sat there and he asked me if there's anything he could help me with. And I said, well, Professor, I'm a little confused about what I'm supposed to know from this book, because I want to make sure I'm prepared for the test, and I want to make sure that I do well in the paper that I'm writing. And he said, well, where are you confused? And I said, well, I don't really get this, and I don't get that, and I don't get this. And he said, well, you read the book. What'd you learn? And I thought, I learned that, Alvin Toffler wrote the book and that he was a doctor of blah, 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 and that his concern was this or that. He said, no, that's not what I asked you. About life, what have you learned? And I said, I don't understand. He said, what's your major? And I told him. And at the time, I was interested in studying forest management and wildlife management, which had nothing whatever to do with his course. He said, oh, okay, well, then this course really doesn't matter in that sense. So what matters is that you're taking something with you from this course that you'll use your entire life. What did you learn? And I said, well, I guess I learned that it's very difficult to stay true to who you are when you're different and everyone else wants you to be the same. He paused for a second, he looked at me, and he said, then this book and this course has been good for you. When you write your paper, I want you to write your paper about that. I remember him, and then he said to me, now, do you have any other questions? I said, no. He said, okay, I have another student. And that was the end of that. But I remember in his lecture one time, he said, it's very important, if we take nothing out of the class, he said in his lecture one time, I'll never forget this, he said, you're going to be in college long enough to get your degree if you stay in college that long. And then you're going to go on with your life, and you're not going to use probably 78 or 80% of what you've learned here. If you walk away from college with this one thing, just one thing, if you just learn this, if you just learn that you were created as an individual with an individual mind and a perspective on life that no one else on the planet has, because only you can see it. Only you can experience it. If you just learn that and then never forget it and never give it up as long as you live, then your college experience will have been valuable to you. This is where groupthink makes no sense. And this is where I think the danger in our society comes from. Our kids are no longer taught to be critical thinkers unless we teach them. They're no longer taught that their individuality is valuable unless we teach them. They are taught that they must conform, that they must think like everybody else. They must believe like everybody else. They must function like everybody else. They have to dress like everybody else. They have to do everything like everybody else. And if they don't, they're wrong. There's something wrong with them. Now, I want you to know, if you don't already, that I learned that lesson very well, because if you think about it, in today's society, I'm an old guy, I'm a white guy, I'm a male, I'm a heterosexual, I'm a Christian, I'm a gun owner, I'm a conservative thinker, and I'm a thinker, by the way. I am a person who believes that capitalism works, and as a business owner, I have seen it works. I understand how it works, and I understand that it works better than other systems like socialism or communism or Marxism. I understand why. I actually read and study things because I want to make my own decisions and come to my own conclusions about things, and I tend not to succumb to peer pressure. And trust me, as a guy on YouTube, when you put yourself out on YouTube in particular, there's a ton of pressure to go one way or the other, and you've got to be pretty thick-skinned and a pretty solid individual in order not to succumb to that, and I don't. I credit that in large part to my Creator, to God, who I have great faith in, But I also credit it to these teachers who, when I was growing up, expressed so sincerely and so forcefully that being a critical thinker was a very important thing for each and every one of us to be, that we should not simply accept what someone else says as valid and true without first investigating it for ourselves, that we should not simply jump on the bandwagon, as the old saying goes, and go down a particular direction without examining the facts around it. Certainly, we should not accept the word of Hollywood people whose best words come from other people who write them, and whose screwball, oddball, twisted, bent philosophies come out of their own mouths when they finally are given an opportunity to speak for themselves. They are just mouthpieces, pretenders, and we shouldn't give so much weight to them. We certainly shouldn't give any weight to a guy like Bill Maher. He has no idea what he's talking about. He's an uber-rich guy who lives an uber-rich life. He probably has no idea how much a dozen eggs cost, and probably hasn't done his own shopping, his own laundry, or cleaned his own car, driven his own car, probably for decades. He has no idea how real, honest, hardworking Americans live. So he feels the freedom to insult them, and he thinks that's going to do him well. Well, that's the mark of a fool. So I want to encourage you, as we move forward, you and I, as we try to safeguard our country and restore it as it was founded by our framers, as we look at the Second Amendment and the Constitution, that we remember that it's important to be critical thinkers, not to buy into groupthink, not to jump on the bandwagon with everybody else, regardless of whether that's a pro-Second Amendment position or an anti-Second Amendment position. Let's look at these things critically and decide, each one of us, for ourselves. You are an individual person. There is no other one on the planet like you. You're the only one. You have your own mind. You have your own way of thinking. You have your own perspective and view of the world. No one else has that but you. Don't you ever forget it, and don't you ever give it up. Now, if you are on Patreon, I want you to stick with me, because we're going to go into the rest of the podcast and talk about my hunting trip. If you're listening to the syndicated podcast at this point, that's where we're going to wrap it up. I thank you very much for listening. I urge you to support us on Patreon so you can hear the balance of it if you choose to do that. But even if you don't, I thank you so very much for all of your support, for everything you do, and wherever you go, whatever you do, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuyTV podcast.